Hi, I'm Michael Tressler, a Senior Customer Engineer with Microsoft. Welcome to Module 7, Managing Teams Rooms, Part 2, where we will focus on the management of Windows as it relates to Teams Rooms. Are Teams Rooms just another computer? Well, that's going to be the topic of discussion today. We're going to be talking about managing the underlying Windows OS on Microsoft Teams Rooms. There's been a number of questions around how to secure Teams Rooms, how to make it a secure computing platform, and how do you manage the underlying Windows OS. Teams Rooms is not just another computer. Teams Rooms signs into Windows with a local user account called Skype. This user account does not have a password associated with it, and it will automatically sign into Windows every time the device boots up. So how do we manage the underlying OS? Well, there are a couple of supported mechanisms to do that. And something that I like to often tell people is just because it's supported doesn't mean that you should use it. A couple of traditional tools like Active Directory, Microsoft Endpoint Manager, System Center Configuration Manager, Policies in Intune, Azure Active Directory. What should we use? What is the best tool to manage Teams Rooms? Just because you can, and just because it's supported, doesn't mean you should. The question ultimately is answered best by each individual use case. Some of you will have a very robust Active Directory team and a set of processes and procedures for managing devices on your network. And in those cases, Active Directory and group policies may be a very viable option for managing the underlying OS. Some of you may have adopted a cloud-first, mobile-first strategy and have a very robust set of processes and procedures in place for Intune. In that case, Azure Active Directory and Intune may make the most sense. Ultimately, what platform is used to manage Teams Rooms? There are some things that you will definitely want to be aware of. Our guidance is that you treat Teams Rooms very differently than a traditional computer on your network. And a lot of that has to do with how Teams Rooms is configured out of the box, how they're secured out of the box, and the Skype account that automatically logs into the device. We highly recommend that you strongly consider excluding both Teams Rooms resource accounts that are used to sign into Teams Rooms, as well as the compute modules, really Windows, from common policies that may be in place in your environment. These could be conditional access policies or group policy objects that do things like set password requirements or set things like the automatic sleep mode or the power conditions of devices. The resource accounts also do not support multi-factor authentication. If you think about how the Skype account signs into Windows and how the resource account is used to sign into Teams, think about that device restarting every morning at 2:30 a.m. With multi-factor authentication, you could very quickly get into a scenario where all of the Teams rooms across your environment can no longer sign in because they're being challenged for a multi-factor authentication mechanism. So some things that definitely you should take into consideration when you're setting up Teams Room is that they do absolutely need to be treated very differently than any other computer on your network. This usually causes quite a bit of concern and angst with security information departments. And so what we've done is we've attempted to make the Teams Rooms platform as secure of a computing environment as possible. And a couple of the ways we do that is by requiring certain controls from each of our OEM partners. The first thing that we do is that we require a hardware mechanism by which things like cables and buttons can be properly secured away from users so that users cannot unplug, for instance, cameras or microphones. We've locked down Teams Rooms so that users can't plug in USB drives or copy data to Windows. The next thing that we require from all of our many OEM manufacturers is a Trusted Platform Module, or TPM, chip to be present in these devices, and we use this TPM chip to enable secure boot with direct memory access protection. We also use this TPM chip to lock down the username and password for the resource account in the Windows Vault. Now, the Windows Vault is a secure container deep within the Windows 10 operating system that's used for things like biometric data. You may be familiar with Windows Hello, which is a mechanism for signing into a computer with either fingerprint or facial recognition. That data is securely stored in Windows 10 in what we call the Windows Vault, and Teams Rooms uses that same Windows Vault to store the username and password for the resource account. We do a couple other things too. We have a keyboard filter in place that blocks all special keyboard combinations that may potentially allow a user to break outside of the Teams Rooms app on the device. So we block things like Control-Alt-Delete, Alt-F4, Control-Shift-Escape, etc. And we're doing this in an attempt to make sure that the device is as secure as possible. We do things like prevent all users from being able to access the device across the network except for those users explicitly added to the local administrators group. We disable guest logins on the device. We do things like set the default auto run behavior to not execute, and we use hypervisor enforced code integrity. This loads the Teams Rooms app into a virtual container, and then we can run checks on that container to ensure that only the code that we've signed is properly run in that environment. Every night at 2:01 a.m. local time, there's a scheduled task that kicks off a sequence of events. That sequence of events runs a number of scripts to ensure that the device is locked down per our specifications and, if necessary, resets settings back to the way they should be. That process also goes out to the Windows Store and checks for any app updates for both the Teams Rooms app and for Windows. It waits 30 minutes and then reboots the device. Now there's a folder on the C drive of Teams Rooms, and the path is conveniently there on your screen, but it is in C:/users/Skype/script launch cache. This folder will contain many of the scripts that are running on a nightly basis. And you are free to inspect those scripts to verify what types of controls we're using to lock down the devices. Another method for reviewing those scripts as well as the base image is you can download the SRS deployment kit. Now that name is a holdover from when the technology used to be called Skype Room System. You can download the deployment kit and extract the AppX file and all of the scripts and the configuration for Teams Rooms. So if you want to know, are these devices really locked down, or how are these devices locked down, what types of security controls are enabled out of the box, you can just look at a lot of the scripts. You're encouraged to look through some of those scripts as well as that deployment kit to get a feel for how well these devices really are secured and a lot of the thought that went into ensuring that these devices are not just another standard computer on your network. Alright, so let's get into some of the management tools. The first one we'll talk about is Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory is a cloud service. It's a subscription-based service that's a part of the Microsoft Cloud Platform, and this is the next iteration of Active Directory. It's intended to be a platform to manage identities, to manage devices, to manage objects, and a large number of other things that might want to be managed in an environment. It's 100% cloud-based, and it's very robust and scalable. So how does Teams Rooms come into play for Azure Active Directory? Well, you can join Teams Rooms to Azure Active Directory. This allows you to do things like get device health reports on device locations, user sign-ins, things of that nature. There are two primary join methods. The first one is pure straight-up Azure AD join, and the second one is a hybrid Azure AD join in combination with an on-premises Active Directory. So should you do this? Should you Azure AD join devices for management? We think that this is the best solution for managing the underlying Windows OS on Teams Rooms. You can create a dynamic security group that automatically pulls in any Teams Rooms in the environment and adds it to that dynamic security group. One way you can do that is similar to what we see at the top of this slide. you can set the computer name of Teams rooms to begin with tr dash or end with dash tr, and then have that dynamic group look for machines with that naming convention and put them into the group. You can then use this dynamic security group to exclude Teams rooms from any sort of policy that may interfere with its operation. Azure Active Directory allows you to dynamically enroll Teams rooms in Intune, and it allows you to use dynamic security groups. Note that these features require Azure Active Directory Premium P1. So if you're in an environment that does not have Azure AD Premium Plan 1, then you may want to consider whether or not Azure Active Directory is the right management tool for you. Okay, Microsoft Endpoint Manager. So Endpoint Manager is really less of a platform or less of a single technology and more of a portal endpoint manager, bringing together a number of cloud services and some on-prem services into a single management portal. So from Microsoft Endpoint Manager, you can do things like manage Windows updates. You can manage security endpoints like Windows Defender firewalls. And you can optimize updates to do things like pull updates from other machines on your networks. So Microsoft Endpoint Manager. Microsoft Endpoint Manager is really less of a platform or less of a single technology and more of a portal. A little portal of endpoint management, bringing together a number of cloud services and some on-premises services into a single management portal. So for Microsoft Endpoint Manager, you can do things like manage Windows updates. You can manage security endpoints like Windows Defender firewalls. You can optimize updates to do things like pull updates from other machines on your network. Remember, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. System Center Configuration Manager may be familiar to you. It is predominantly used as an on-premises tool to manage local Active Directory devices. It is a comprehensive, very robust, very deep technical product. It usually requires, at a minimum, of one person that really understands the tool set. And I've seen a lot of customers that have at least one or two people, and it's their full-time job to manage Configuration Manager. Does it make sense to use System Center Configuration Manager? Ultimately, this is going to come down to your environment and what your current processes and procedures look like and how well they're managed. With Configuration Manager, we're really looking at that first entry and the bottom one, inventorying Teams rooms, and then using Configuration Manager to configure endpoint protection, such as a firewall and Microsoft Defender. Technically, you can deploy new Teams rooms images using Configuration Manager, but we strongly discourage that. It really provides very little benefit, has a lot of complication, and can generally lead to more trouble than it's worth. So that brings us to Intune. What is Intune? Intune is a subscription-based service that's part of the Microsoft Cloud Platform. It is really intended to manage devices. You can do things like package applications to deploy down to devices. You can manage things like security controls, do things like enable BitLocker, and manage things like the firewall. With MDM capabilities with Microsoft Intune, you can automatically configure things like VPNs. You can do things like inventory, reporting, and management. Does Intune make sense? Is Intune the right management platform for a Teams room? Intune in combination with Azure Active Directory will provide the best management experience for Microsoft Teams rooms. But like everything else, just because you can doesn't mean you should, and I'll reiterate that every environment is different. Earlier, we talked about the Skype user accounts on the devices and the fact that the Skype user account automatically signs into Windows. And when Windows signs in, the Teams Rooms app automatically launches. The Teams Rooms app will then reach into the Windows Vault, grab the credentials for the resource account, and attempt to sign into Microsoft 365. In Intune, a lot of device administrators will configure things like conditional access policies. So when an account attempts to sign into Microsoft 365, Intune will do a check on that account to ensure that the organization to ensure that the device itself matches any compliance requirements the organization may have. And it will then pass a login attempt over to Azure Active Directory if the account that's being attempted to sign in requires any sort of conditional access, or if there's any multi-factor authentication enabled for that account. If you're using things like conditional access or multi-factor authentication for resource accounts on the MTR, this could potentially cause an issue with signing into Teams Rooms. So what do we say? We say don't use conditional access and don't use multi-factor authentication for the resource accounts in Teams Rooms. There are a couple ways to enroll Teams Rooms into Intune. The first can be done through the device itself in Settings, and our favorite method is using an Azure Active Directory auto enrollment. Something to keep in mind that when a device is enrolled in Intune, it will only honor device-specific policies. And so if you have an Intune policy that's targeting user settings in some ways, that will not apply to Teams Rooms. Intune has a number of device configuration profiles or device configuration settings, most of which aren't supported. There's a fantastic blog article that goes into much more depth around what you can do with Intune and what you can't do with Intune. It also details what we recommend that you do or don't do with Intune. We've created a great simple URL, and it is aka.ms/IntuneMTR. So what are the supported configuration profiles? Administrative templates allow you to set virtually every possible Windows setting imaginable. We highly recommend you avoid these. There's a configuration profile for certificates, though. This is potentially beneficial for environments where you have an on-premises Skype for Business environment and you want Teams Rooms to sign into on-prem Skype for Business as well as Teams. This is a very legitimate case for Intune device configuration profiles. Being able to push down the private certificates for the Skype for Business deployment is very beneficial, and it's a good use case for Intune device configuration policies. Another device configuration policy that may be very beneficial to a large number of customers is the Windows Updates Delivery Optimization. This allows you to configure devices to download Windows updates from peers on the network rather than going out to the internet to download those updates. Device restrictions, this is another one of those things that you can use. It's technically supported, but we would challenge you to consider if it's necessary. Just remember, anything that you do to change the out-of-box configuration on Teams Rooms moves you away from a known good configuration. Almost every time I interact with a customer that's having issues with Teams Rooms, as soon as we start digging under the covers, we find that they've done things to change the image or change the out-of-box configuration. When you're looking at doing things like using Intune device configuration profiles, strongly consider asking if this is something that's necessary. Is this something that is ultimately going to improve the user experience? Device compliance policies. So as I mentioned earlier, Teams Rooms will only honor device compliance policies. They will not honor any sort of user compliance policies. Some customers have said that we need to ensure that we are requiring code integrity, or we're requiring secure boots, or we're requiring BitLocker on the device so that they remain in a healthy state, at least as viewed within Intune. And that's okay. I mean, turning these on is not necessarily recommended, but it's okay. In the Intune device compliance policies, you can flip those little switches over to require BitLocker, require secure boot, and require code integrity. It's not really necessary because, as I mentioned earlier, every morning at 2:30 a.m., we're going to reapply most of these settings, whether you require them or not. But, flip them if you want, but not really going to make a big difference to the security of Teams rooms. If you were going to go down the road of device compliance policies, you will want to pay particular attention to the minimum OS version that's required. Teams rooms require specific versions of Windows 10. Often a new version or two of Windows 10 will be released that is not supported by Teams rooms. If you set a device compliance policy that says every device that enrolls in Intune is going to be required to have a recent version of Windows before it's in a healthy state, that's not going to work. Don't do it. This goes back to my earlier statement. Just set up a security group. Whether it's a static security group or a dynamic security group, put all Teams rooms compute modules and all of the Teams rooms resource accounts in those security groups, and just exclude them from all of the baseline policies and controls that are in an environment today. And let's create our own new controls specifically for Teams rooms. So what happens if we set a password requirement as part of a device compliance policy? The Skype user account that doesn't have a password and tries to sign into Windows at 2:30 in the morning when the device reboots won't be able to sign in. You can have a lot of very upset coworkers on your hands in the morning. Don't do it. You can configure device compliance policies for things like the TPM, antivirus, and anti-spyware. Ask yourself, is this a requirement? Does it make sense to apply to Teams rooms? I would argue that it doesn't, and I would argue that we're managing all of these controls out of the box for you, and we're applying these at 2 a.m. every morning. Now, it may make someone feel good to turn these toggle switches on to require certain password changes or settings, but it's not actually going to increase the security of the devices. Ask yourself, does flipping all these switches ultimately improve the end user's experience? And does flipping all these switches ultimately improve security? All right, so hopefully this slide is going to be useful for you. So what should and what should not be done? If you're told, yeah, sorry, we're not going to exclude Teams rooms from all our policies, remind those people that things like the automatic timeout of Windows sessions or the auto lock capability of a Windows session, things like power management, things like multi-factor authentication, MFA, things like starting a certain program at logon, all of these things will degrade the user experience and potentially make Teams rooms unusable. If you receive pushback, challenge the decisions around why these policies are implemented or why these policies may need to be applied to Teams rooms, and inform them that unlike most computers, this one already shows up hardened. How do you add your own local admin via Intune? We absolutely recommend you at the very minimum change the password on the built-in admin account. Or a step further would be to create your own admin accounts with some unique name and some unique password. And a step further would be to push down local admins via Intune. This article will help you getting this configured, and we highly recommend you do at least some of the things I just mentioned. Group policies are largely an on-premises Active Directory tool to manage policy settings on devices. Most group policy objects are not going to apply to Teams rooms, and we would strongly encourage you to have a security group or an organizational unit in on-premises Active Directory that all of your Teams rooms are part of. Starting to sound like a broken record that yes, always create dedicated groups for the Teams rooms Windows side and the Teams rooms resource account side, and set specific policies only to them, and block inheritance of any other policies. If there are GPO settings that you need to deploy to Teams rooms, you can then use that unique organizational unit and unique security group to apply just the group policy object settings that are required in your environment. So what is group policy really useful for? QoS, quality of service. The only effective or realistic way to manage large numbers of Teams rooms for QoS settings is through a GPO policy. There are other ways to do it. You could use PowerShell, for instance, to set registry keys. But you'll find in environments where QoS is used, they may be using group policy to set those QoS markings on devices. We actually recommend taking a different approach nowadays. We actually recommend strongly considering marking traffic at the switch endpoint based on source and destination address. And that is useful because not every device anymore that runs Teams is a Windows device, and group policy only applies to Windows. Setting QoS at the switch port or at the Wi-Fi access point will help mark traffic from not just Windows, but Android, iOS, macOS, and Linux. Regardless of which direction you go, whether or not you choose to have Windows set those DSCP markings, or you choose to have those markings set at the individual switch port level, there are a couple of things that you will want to do in the Teams Admin Center to set up the Teams environment for quality of service. In the Teams Admin Center, under Meetings, and then under Meeting Settings, you'll find a section for Network, and there's a toggle switch. That switch is entitled Insert Quality of Service Markers for Real-Time Media Traffic, and the default setting for this is turned off. Ordinarily, that's not a big deal, except if you want to use QoS. If you want to use quality of service, you'll want to turn this toggle switch on. At the moment in Windows 10, that does exactly nothing for a Windows 10 operating system, hence the need for something like a group policy object or switch port markings. What that toggle switch does do is it tells the Teams application to break out the media traffic into different UDP ports. When that switch is set to off, all media, audio, video, and screen sharing will use UDP port 3478. When you turn that switch on, the Teams client will break out audio to be 3479, video to 3480, and screen sharing to 3481 as the destination ports for Teams transport relays. You'll notice that there's a section in this screen for configuring specific port ranges. This is the client source port for each of those media types. We recommend using at least 20 ports for each modality. If you are deploying Teams rooms in an environment where QoS is already in play, you may already have these source port ranges defined on your switches from a Skype for Business deployment, for example. If that's the case, you'll want to request from networking what those existing configurations are and set these port ranges to be whatever is in use today on your switches. Most of you, or at least your networking team, will have their own opinions as to which DSCP values you use for each media type. But we sort of fall in line with the typical industry standard, and so we recommend 46 for audio, 34 for video, and 18 for screen sharing. There's a great short URL called aka.ms/QoS in Teams. And so if you're interested in digging into this topic a little bit further or learning a little more about this, you can use that short URL to learn all kinds of things on QoS and Teams. Does it make sense to use GPO when managing Teams rooms? Should we use group policies? I can't answer that for you, but hopefully this is giving you a little bit of information to work with and help make that determination if this is one of the right tools for you to use when managing Teams rooms. How do we manage updates on Teams rooms, or how do we roll back from a previous update? Well, the short answer is if you need to roll back to a previous update, probably the only recommended supported way to do that is to roll back to the out-of-box OEM image that came when you first powered on the device. We'll talk about that a little in upcoming slides, but really there's no way to roll back the Teams Rooms app. As I mentioned several times, the devices will kick off a scheduled task at 2:01 a.m. local time, and that's based on the time zone of the Teams rooms. During that time period, it does a number of things. It deletes some cache data that is on the device. It optimizes the Teams app for resource utilization. It will check both the Windows Store and Windows Update, if there are any updates, and then install them. And it will reapply some security settings. It takes about 30 minutes for that full process to complete, and you'll see the device reboot right after 2:30 a.m. each morning. The Microsoft Teams Room app is a store-signed app, and it is updated through the Microsoft Store. That store signing process comes into play with the hypervisor code-enforced integrity that was mentioned earlier. It is possible to download the Teams Rooms installation package and extract the AppX file and deploy that package through something like Configuration Manager or Intune. This is beneficial for those few customers that absolutely require controlling what version of the Teams app is running on their devices. We really don't recommend doing this. It requires an inordinate amount of overhead, complexity, and management to get this right. And the reason being is because it only takes one mistake to where you now have an entire estate of Teams rooms that have issues or can't sign in, won't start up, or won't boot up. Just because it's possible doesn't mean that you should. So we provide the control and the mechanisms for those few customers that need it and that have very specific requirements. But in most scenarios, I would strongly recommend avoiding specific app version management. Updating Windows is almost always a terrible idea on Teams Rooms, and the reason for that is because the Teams app on Teams Rooms requires a specific version of Windows. Almost every single version of Windows that's been released, we've had to delay the installation of that Windows version on Teams Rooms until we can validate the Teams Rooms app works properly with that version of Windows. So you have this beautiful working Teams Rooms, and someone's fiddled with something, or someone's pushed down a policy that's caused some issues. For whatever reason, someone's installed some software on the device. Maybe someone's installed some antivirus software that's conflicting with the Teams app, or someone's installed some security agents that monitors everything that's on the screen, or whatever. How can we recover from a situation like that? There is a recovery tool that you can download that will help you to repair Teams Rooms or reset the device back to factory. If the device has not had a custom image laid down on it, or the partition table hasn't been tinkered with, this tool will work. You can download the installation package and run a recoverytool.ps1 script. For repair, press option 1 to repair the device. Give it a little time, it'll reboot, and you should be good to go. Now, if things are a little worse off, do the same thing, download the installation package, run recoverytool.ps1, but this time select option 2 to reset the device. When you get to the point where it asks you if you want to keep your files or do you want to remove everything, just select remove everything. Teams Rooms devices don't store any files anyway, so nothing worth saving. So on the next screen, it's going to say, ask, validate, are you sure you want to remove everything? Go ahead. Click reset, and then depending on the particular Teams Rooms you have, this could take an hour, it could take 2.5 hours, it could take longer. think the shortest amount of time that we've seen is about 45 minutes. So it can be a very lengthy process. So be sure you have plenty of time to let this go through its paces. If you do need to go through this procedure, just be patient and be aware that it might take a while. And then catastrophic recovery when the device won't even boot, or it boots and kind of crashes a lot, and you've tried repair and reset, and none of that works. Now's the time where you need to reach out to your vendor and get the custom image from them. They can provide you with a custom Windows image, which is the image that was shipped with the device, with the compute module. So work with the vendor. They'll give you instructions. They'll get the Windows image to you, and then you can just basically do a fresh install of Teams Rooms and start from the beginning. And if it's worse than that, then it's a hardware problem, and you'll need to get a hard drive replaced or memory swapped out or something. But again, work with the vendor on that. This brings us to Microsoft Teams Rooms Premium. You may decide that, okay, we can build our servers on Teams Rooms and we're pretty confident, but we just don't have the time in the day to manage all this. Or we're really new and we're really not sure what we're doing, we could use some help. That's the point of Microsoft Teams Rooms Premium. It's a 24/7, 365 monitoring, alerting, incident management, and resolution service that will help from everything such as designing your rooms all the way through to troubleshooting issues that happen. For example, if a USB camera is having problems, they can send a remote USB reset to address that. The Teams Rooms Premium service will validate and make sure that all of the security on Teams Rooms is as it should be, and they will handle the software and firmware update maintenance. They will make sure that even the cameras and the microphones and the speakers all have firmware updates, not just Windows and the Teams Rooms app. Because the operations center that handles Teams Rooms Premium sees so many devices, they can take their learnings from all those customers and give them to you. Also, Teams Rooms Premium gives you custom inventory, health, and compliance reports. You can see an example right there on the screen. It can also give you analytics from all of these learnings from all of the customers. As the knowledge base builds up about managing Teams Rooms, you can gain all of that insight as well. Now, if you have remote offices or branch offices that have Teams Rooms, but they don't have an IT representative, Teams Rooms Premium can send a person out to that location. And those people are from our trusted service partners. They've been vetted and they will get on site and they will fix whatever the issue is, such as a bad cable or even resetting a Teams Rooms if that's what it takes. For Teams Rooms Premium to work, there's an agent that is installed on each of the Teams Rooms compute modules, and that agent will handle software updates as well as handle firmware for cameras and microphones and other peripherals. We can also mitigate issues through reboots. We can proactively reboot the device, reset USB connections, change states of USB, and things like that. If there's a bigger issue, these experienced technicians on the Microsoft end can download the logs, look at them, and figure out the best course of action. Note that we do not record audio, video, media, or any meeting content. It's strictly telemetry data or commands that are sent to the Teams Rooms device to do something like download and install a firmware. There's only one outbound port that's required, and that is port 443. As you see there's something called AMQP over WebSockets, and that's Advanced Message Queuing Protocol. That's basically the protocol that handles the signaling so that when one of the technicians sends a request to the device, such as reset USB, the AMQP protocol is what polls for those requests and then pulls it down and does the action that's requested. Finally, a little bit about personally identifiable information. We do not collect PII. All of that information is scrubbed locally on the device prior to the agent sending it to the service for reporting. We don't collect things like the meeting subject, and we don't collect things like who attended the meeting. Keep in mind, though, that information will be pushed to Microsoft 365 for Teams Admin Center and call quality diagnostics. But Teams Rooms Premium does not have access to that information. If you'd like more information on our privacy statements, visit aka.ms/privacy. And here's just a little more information on other details that get pulled into the Microsoft Teams Rooms Premium service, such as some event log information. And there will be some Windows system queries, such as listing USB devices and things like that. Okay, thank you for paying attention through Module 7. And if you're moving along in order, it's time for Module 8, Tips, Tricks, and Troubleshooting.